What you see here is a map of Jewish populations in Europe in 1939, all right? And each circle represents a larger Jewish population in that particular nation. So we can see that the mass of Jews in Europe are primarily in Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union and Poland have the two largest Jewish populations. But then when we remember that Poland is a much smaller populated nation than the Soviet Union, we can understand that the Jews of Poland make up a pretty sizable chunk of that nation's population. All right? We are going to do the Arab-Israeli conflict at the end of the year, so we're going to talk a little bit more about this. So I just want you to kind of understand some roots to this anti-Semitism and ultimately the Holocaust in Europe. And also when we bring it into the history of the Americas, the migration of Eastern Europeans and particularly Eastern European Jews out of Eastern Europe and eventually to the Americas. First and foremost, Jews have been scattered throughout much of Europe for centuries. All right? If you go way back, and you're not writing this down, you're just listening, if you go way back to early Jewish history in like the 1st century of the Common Era, the Jews of the world lived in what is today Israel. Then it was a Roman province called Syria, Palestina. And they lived there, and that was their religious homeland and their cultural homeland, and they'd been there for centuries. All right? And then in the year 70 CE, following a series of uprisings and protests by the Jews of Palestine, the Romans squashed them. The Romans destroyed their temple. The Romans caused, like basically you leave or you die. The Romans caused a major event in Jewish history known as the diaspora. You might have heard of this or remember this from maybe 9th grade history, where the Jews of Palestine spread out. Some of them went deeper into the Middle East. Some of them went into North Africa. Some of them pushed to the north. Some went all the way across North Africa and hopped into Spain. Some pushed further into the north. And then through many more centuries of history, those populations in those new areas would grow. By the time we get to 1939, we notice a couple things. Jews are within most European nations. Jews are larger populations in Eastern Europe. Hardly any Jews in Spain. This goes back to 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Also 1492, Spain expelled the Muslims and the Jews from their country. Yes?
Why is the same true of USSR because of all of the forced migrations imposed upon Jews?
Why?
I know in the
Okay, so what you're talking about, very good. In the 1800s in Russia, so the Soviet Union, what we find is that those nations that have the largest Jewish populations tend to have the largest issues. Like Spain can pat itself on the back and say, we're not anti-Semitic, because there are no Jews in Spain. While Jews in Eastern Europe and Jews in Russia are going to be suffering some serious hard times. In the 1800s, back in the late 1700s, in fact, Catherine the Great is going to essentially force the Jews of Russia into what is known, you guys don't have to write this, just hear it, into what is known as the Pale of Settlement, essentially forcing the Jews of Russia to live in one section of Western Russia. And so they, couldn't be spread out throughout all cities, throughout all lands. As we push into the late 1800s, there's a Russian Tsar, a guy named Alexander II, who's going to be assassinated. All right? And with this assassination, we've got some political chaos in Russia. And the government is going to encourage the targeting by the civilian population of the Russian Jewish population in Russia as kind of retribution or to blame for this political chaos. All right? And so we're going to see an uptick in the late 1800s, 1880s, 1890s, of what we call pogroms. And a pogrom is a organized riot and violence against the Jewish population. And this starts in Russia, but eventually we're going to see it happening in other European nations. And with this, with an uptick in violence, you know, the Jews were never accepted by the community, but now they're like being killed. With an uptick in violence, there began to be this push for Jews to move somewhere else where they can live their lives without this violence. And so many Jews started to move to like Western Europe. All right? Many Jews from Eastern, and remember, this is 1939. These Jewish populations weren't as big back in the 1880s because most Jews lived in Eastern Europe. As they pushed to the west, with them is going to go more anti-Semitism. As Jewish populations will rise in France, or as Jewish populations will rise in England, there's going to be increasing anti-Semitism. You guys might remember a movie from your childhood called An American Tale, about this adorable little mouse named Fievel. You guys may or may not remember this. It's from my childhood, actually. You guys would have watched it after it had long come out. If you're familiar with this, it's about a little mouse who immigrates to the United States with his family, but he gets separated from his family. But what you probably wouldn't have gotten because you were like 7 when you saw this movie is that little Fievel was actually little Fievel Mouskowitz. He was a Russian Jewish mouse. And he and his Russian Jewish family were being persecuted in the late 19th century in Russia. And they had this dream that they could go to America because there's no persecution of Jews in America. The big song, the big dance number in the beginning of that movie is that there are, well, who would hate mice more than anybody else? Cats hate mice, right? And so the big song and dance number in the beginning of this movie is that there are no cats in America. And the streets are paved with cheese. Very good, yeah. And so the family packs their bags, and they make their way to England, and they get on a boat, and they make their way across the Atlantic, and they get it off at Ellis Island, and then they realize, what? There's totally cats in America. And this becomes a part of the issue that will be acknowledged by a guy like named Theodor Herzl. You'll hear his name later in the year. He's a guy that advocated that the Jews should have a homeland in their traditional biblical homeland in Palestine. Because he says that wherever we go, we, the Jewish people, are taking the seeds of anti-Semitism with us. So there aren't any Jews in America, or there are small numbers of Jews in America in the late 19th century. But when we start moving there, we are actually planting the seeds of we're giving the people there something to hate. And hate we did, all right? By the late 19th century, certainly the early 20th century, there's going to be an increase in anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States. Anti-immigrant sentiment, and the Jews will suffer some of the worst of this. Now, we also talked about how Asians will actually be like eliminated in the 1920s from immigrating to the United States. So they're getting it bad as well. But the Jews of Eastern Europe are also going to face some of this persecution. Here's a group of Jews that have gotten off of a ship at Ellis Island, and they're making their way to be processed. So some Jews would come over. By the late 19th, early 20th century, over 25 million immigrants are going to make their way into the United States, mostly from Southern and Eastern Europe. This is the second major wave of immigration to the United States. In early American history, we got a lot of people from like England, and a lot of Germans came, but primarily we were like English kind of people. Late 19th century, as the United States is going through an industrial boom, we start bringing in new populations. We bring in a lot of Italians. We bring in a lot of Eastern Europeans. And this is going to cause nativist sentiment, you know this word, right? Nativist sentiment in the United States to increase. Because all these people that are coming in, they're different. They speak differently. English people come and they speak English. Maybe with funny accent, but they speak English. Italians come and they speak Italian. Poles come and they speak Polish. All right? This isn't it. Russians come and they speak Russian. And then their religion's not the same. Italians come, what's their religion? They're Catholics. Poles come, what's their religion? Catholics. And then you got all these Jews that are coming. And that's different. Or you got Russians coming that might be Eastern Orthodox Christians. They're not like these, you guys ever heard the acronym WASP? Yeah. The White Anglo-Saxon Protestant? And these WASPs in America that made up at the time a majority of America, a lot of them are getting freaked out by these new folks coming in. Because they're going to change us, they're going to change who we are. And by the 1920s, we start to see an increase in nativist sentiment and a backlash by the American Congress to limit immigration by a number of immigration acts. All right. This is all happening at the same time of other major world events. In 1929, what happens in the United States? Great Depression, we say, kind of gets ushered in with the stock market crash. So we have a major economic downturn beginning in the late 1920s, early 1930s. And then almost at the same time as that, we get the rise of Nazism in Germany. So at the same time that Nazi ideology is coming to power in Germany, and Nazi ideology that Adolf Hitler writes about in Mein Kampf, like calling for ultimately the end of the Jewish race. At the same time, Jews are going to be started to be persecuted in Germany like never before. Other nations of the world start closing their doors. We can't let outsiders in. Yes, they might change our culture, or yes, they're different from us, but they're also taking our jobs. Does this sound like familiar to some immigration debates that happen to this day? Like, we don't sound all that different. We don't sound all that different in racial sentiment, and we don't sound all that different in economic sentiment, with the notion that people are coming in and changing American culture. All right, we've long had this argument. Yes, sir?
Do people understand that, like, the things they were saying were not, like, pleasant? Because I know the arguments are still the same, but people are, like, afraid of saying it outright most of the time.
You mean today?
Yeah. Whereas in the past, they were, like...
Back then, you weren't afraid. Yeah, I think...
Like, it's just everywhere.
I think it was more commonplace and more accepted back then. Now, when most people hear, like, some of Donald Trump's comments, for example, most people are like, really, Donald Trump?
And people still say things like that, but they, like, say it in such a way that it's, like, kind of vague, and they don't really want to...
Or we target, we spend more of our focus on the economic issues rather than the racial issues. Sure. So this is all happening just as the West, just as America, starts to close its doors to outside immigrants by placing, quotas and limits on immigration. We get Nazi escalation of persecution of Jews. I threw this on here really quick just to kind of get a little bit of the sentiment in the United States. This is from a newspaper published by Henry Ford called the Dearborn Independent. And you can see in this little caption from the book, all Ford dealers were required to sell this newspaper. It's a good way to sell your paper if you're Henry Ford, by requiring your paper to be sold across the country in Ford dealerships. And here's a headline article about the international Jew, the world's problem. And this is from 1920, published obviously in Dearborn, Michigan. So this sentiment was not only prevalent in American society, but it was being supported by some of our most wealthy and some of our most powerful industrialists, right?
He actually specifically bought this newspaper just to post about how Jewish people were a problem.
Yeah. Greg, and then you. Greg, go ahead. Yeah. Yes.
What is their effect on the Jewish population?
You know what? I don't know that they have any actual impact outside of probably giving people the chills. It's a very compared to the population at large, it's a very small Nazi movement in the United States. The KKK was much bigger in the 1920s and into the 30s than an American Nazi party was. Relatively small. And then we also remember that the Jewish population in America was a relatively small population as well. Yeah.
My dad was recently in the parade, which is about the lynching of Leo Frank.
Oh, I don't know much about this.
Leo Frank was a Jewish man, and
Okay.
He was accused of raping this little girl. And it eventually now they know because of lie detectors and stuff that it was a black man. But through the play and through the research my dad did about it, he learned about Henry Ford and all
Yeah.
that stuff. And then he also the reason why Leo Frank was lynched and was accused of it was because he was Jewish and because they didn't want to lynch another black man. So,
Very interesting. So this is obviously a story that Jewish Americans are going through in the United States. While this is happening in America, we get the Nazi Party coming to power in Germany in 1933, 1934. In 1935, the Nazi government in Germany passes what are known as the Nuremberg Laws. The Nuremberg Laws. Nuremberg. 1935, the Nuremberg Laws. These are translated so we can actually kind of see what's going on. But essentially the Nuremberg Laws are twofold. First, only those that have quote-unquote German blood can be German citizens. And what this is a big chart of who gets to be citizens in Germany. Like if your grandparents are all German and then your parents are German, well then you're good to go. But if they're, like, and we've got a little code down here, if it's black, if you've got some Jewish in your blood, well, we can, down the road, maybe weed it out a little bit, and you're good to go to be a citizen. But if there's too much, if you're a first-degree crossbreed, then you will never enjoy
Except
such
for
a...
special cases.
And so on down the line. And Jews, of course, cannot be citizens. The Nuremberg Laws would also prohibit intermarriage between Jews and Gentiles, Jews and non-Jews. Prohibit marriage. So this means that Jews cannot marry Germans. This means that Jews in Germany are not citizens, which means they can't vote, they can't hold public office.
Wouldn't you want Germans and Jews to get married so that they could, like this is horrible, like breed the Jew out?
Yeah, I think that's not quick enough. That's not quick enough. And by the same token, unless you did it very carefully, you're going to end up with a lot of like this, which still results in... So at the same time, though, that this is going on, and many Jews in Europe are starting to say, whoa, this is getting crazy here in Germany. Like, we used to like Germany, but now Germany's not too cool anymore. Let's go somewhere else. Well, America, and as we'll talk in a little bit, Latin American nations start closing their doors to immigrants even more because they're now mired in the Great Depression. Can't accept new immigrants even if they are being persecuted in Europe because our economy can't even give people that we have here jobs today. Yes, ma'am?
So what if an immigrant is like richer and can benefit the economy?
Well, we're gonna see a lot of that. Like Albert Einstein, he comes to the United States, no problem. All right. And so a lot of like Germans or German Jewish scientists and intellectuals are able to get into the United States. Having money makes things a lot easier. But the majority of Jews throughout Europe, especially those in Germany, aren't going to have any resources because eventually the Germans are going to take it all from them. So despite this, America is no more willing to accept new Jewish immigrants. Then Hitler continues his push. In 1938, after the Anschluss, where Germany absorbs Austria, the international community doesn't bat an eyelash, right? So this emboldens Hitler to push further with his anti-Jewish laws and acts in Germany itself. By 1938, Jews will be excluded from virtually all economic and educational life in Germany. Jews cannot go to German schools anymore. Jews cannot open up new businesses anymore. Jews are being frozen out of the German society. In 1938, a conference will be held, an international conference will be held in France called the Evian Conference. And this is an international meeting of many nations, Germany not included, to talk about this Jewish refugee issue. A lot of Jews trying to get out of Germany that can't, or get out of Austria and they can't. So there's actually talking about what could happen, and the United States is there. But all it ends up being is a lot of talk. That there's sympathy for these people, but we can't take them. We have our own economic problems. So sympathy for the refugees, but little support. No. Then things get remarkably worse for the Jews in Germany. In November of 1938, an event that for many ushers in the beginning of what becomes the Holocaust is known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. And we mentioned the pogroms of Russia in the late 1800s. This is the pogrom of Germany in 1938, where the government sanctioned and allowed, permitted to happen, anti-Jewish riots in Germany on one particular night. On this one night, And I want you to kind of reference this with things we've dealt with in our own country's history, like the bombings of churches and the burnings of churches, black churches in the American South. That like still happens to this day. This pops up in the news every now and then that another church in the American South has been set on fire, and more often than not, they seem to be African American churches that this is happening to. And every one is absolutely tragic. On Kristallnacht, 1,000 Jewish synagogues were burned across Germany. 91 Jews were killed. And again, I want you guys to think, if you can, about today, and if there was an event in American history today or an event in America today where 91 people would be killed. That would be like earth-shattering for us, right? Like we talk about, I mean, these school shootings, as horrific as they are, they're becoming even more commonplace. The numbers are usually like 5, 10, 15, and we hardly bat an eyelash. But I mean, if something akin to 91 people dying in one coordinated event, that would be earth-shattering news for America for a few days, probably. Or longer, maybe. 30,000 Jews will be placed into concentration camps after Kristallnacht. 7,000 Jewish businesses will be destroyed. Thousands of Jewish homes will be burned down. This will garner international condemnation from the United States, but no action. So we'll condemn it, but we still don't open up our doors to more Jewish migrants, because we've long had a quota system in America, and we will only accept certain numbers of foreign immigrants, and we can't accept any more. Because what's America thinking in the 1930s again? We want to stay out. Our economy needs to be fixed first, and we want to stay out of Europeans' issues. There will be some attempts. At increasing immigration. You guys, if you did your reading, you read about a bill in the House of Representatives called the Wagner-Rogers bill. The Wagner-Rogers bill, in 1939, that proposed opening the door to 20,000 additional immigrants. Children, particularly children, thank you, above the quota. Like, hey, everybody can wrap their head around, like, maybe we don't want all these adults who are going to take our jobs, but little 5-year-olds won't take our jobs. So let's open up our doors, and this would be totally privately funded, and all we have to do is get the government to allow the immigration quotas to be lifted for these kids. Who can't agree to that? The American population and the Congress that elects it. Ultimately, it's defeated. The Wagner-Rogers bill. Now, again, I want you to think, is there a major international refugee crisis going on right now?
Yes.
Yeah. Thousands upon thousands of people fleeing out of Syria looking for refuge, and questions as to where these people are going to go. That's not a debate for us right now. There's a refugee crisis going on right now. Where do these people go? Okay, and there's a debate today in the United States with one side of the argument saying we need to do more. We're like the wealthiest country in the world. We need to do more to aid. And others saying, whoa, we've got our own problems. We can't accept more people, especially people that aren't like us, right? So I think this so closely parallels what we're dealing with today. This is a ship called the SS St. Louis. 930, this is in 1939, 930 Jews aboard this ship making their way to the Americas, hoping to dock in Florida and have those 930 people be able to enter the United States as refugees. The United States refused to allow this ship to dock. The ship returned to Europe. And it's estimated that some 30% of those Jews that were on this ship ultimately would perish in the Holocaust. So the St. Louis is one example, kind of like the poster child example of America literally turning its back to the plight of these refugees. But again, we're a democracy, and we've got laws, and the laws say we can only accept a certain number of migrants. And if we just start letting every ship that washes up on the shore and let all those people in our country, what happens to our country? These are the questions that people had. And remember what we don't know in 1939. What do we not know in 1939? We don't know the ultimate extent of what the Holocaust will be. All right? I had a hand here. Yeah.
Didn't Eleanor Roosevelt do something about?
She advocates. She is supportive. But then again, the First Lady doesn't have any. I mean, she's got the president's ear, but that's about it. All right? And then we come to the war. The war changes the situation for Jews in Europe, makes it far, far worse. But it doesn't do much to change America's willingness to let in immigrants. Because now that the war is going, America is very concerned about spies. Maybe some of these migrants that might be coming in could be German spies, trying to find out information about America. Or they could be what are known as fifth columnists, who would actively try to work against the United States from within. So just because the war is going on and we're going to start hearing about major atrocities against Jews, just because the war is going on does not mean we open our doors anymore to immigrants. By 1942, Adolf Hitler begins what is known as the final solution to the Jewish problem in Europe. These are Hitler's words. And the final solution refers to the now Nazi policy to eradicate Europe of its Jewish population. It called for the systematic massacre of the European Jews. And this is going to be largely done in two ways. First, as German armies march their way across Eastern Europe where the majority of Jews live, following the armies will be special groups of soldiers called Einsatzgruppen. I will spell that for you. It's on there. That was handy that I did that last night. Einsatzgruppen, special units or special groups. These are typically made up of guys, of men that were typically too old to be in the Wehrmacht, the German army. They were too old, so they were like 35, 40-year-old guys, but still wanted to be a part of the war effort. So they would be organized into these special units, and they would follow the German Wehrmacht through Eastern Europe. Their job was not to fight the Soviets, though. Their job was to go village by village through Poland, through Lithuania, through Latvia, through Estonia, into the Soviet Union, and round up those villages' Jews and take them off to the woods and have them dig a grave for themselves and then murder them all. And they kept intricate records of how many Jews lived in those towns, and ultimately how many Jews they found and murdered. And so when people start to question, wait a minute, could it have really been 6 million? They kept track. Absolutely.
Why did they keep track of that? Why is
Because the goal was to kill all the Jews.
We need numbers.
Through the history of civil society, whenever governments need to do much of anything, they have to count their people. Like if you want to collect the taxes, the first thing you have to do is have a census. Let's find out how many people we actually have so people can't hide from us to collect taxes. So you've got to find out how many there are first, and communities had censuses and they knew who their populations were. Find out how many there are, and then we have to find out how many we're killing, and then you see if those numbers match up, and then we can high-five each other that we've done our job here. So the Einsatzgruppen would kill upwards of a couple million of all of the Jews that would die in the Second World War. Yes?
So would they try to kill like every single one?
Every single one. Man, woman, child. What's that?
Would they make sure that they did, like based off of census records?
Absolutely, yeah. They would work to round them up from home to home throughout the entire village. And in many cases, neighbors of Jews are perfectly willing to help out because they don't want to be seen as people that are resisting the Nazis. They don't want to have this punishment come to themselves. So in many cases as well, going through Eastern Europe, most Poles in Poland didn't like the Jewish population themselves. They didn't necessarily want to see this happen to them, but they were as anti-Semitic as anybody else. There's a lot written about these guys because these were just these weren't soldiers necessarily. These were just ordinary Germans that got this job or signed up for this job, and what this job ultimately did to many of them is pretty powerful stuff. So anyway, these are the Einsatzgruppen. Beyond that, we have the ghettoization of Eastern Europe. This is the city of Warsaw. It's a massive city in Poland, and you can see that within Warsaw, the city will be walled, and within these walls, that's where the Jewish population, first of Warsaw, but then Jews from throughout Poland and further even east of Poland, will be sent to ghettos like this. Ghetto is an Italian word from the Middle Ages, when the Jews in Middle Ages Italy were only permitted to live in certain sections of cities. Those were referred to as the ghettos. So that same word is here. What's that?
The little purple area,
I don't know. Anybody?
Austin.
That's like a plaza. I don't know though. I don't know.
Austin, translate.
Anybody translate that? Anyway, so the Jews of Poland would go to ghettos like this. Eventually, these ghettos would be massively overcrowded. No access to medical care, limited food access, so there'd be starvation. But this makes it easier for when the time comes to what's called, you looked it up, what do you got?
Yeah, it's the square in Warsaw under German occupation where Jews were gathered for deportation.
Okay. So you would go from here to there eventually on, these are rail lines. That makes a lot of sense now. Thank you. To get on the trains and to head out. So eventually the ghettos would be liquidated. Here's a photo of the Warsaw Ghetto and its liquidation, which means taking all the people of the Warsaw Ghetto and now putting them on cattle cars and sending them to concentration camps and ultimately death camps. One of the biggest is known as Auschwitz in Poland. This would be the most notorious, the largest of the Nazi death camps. Here's one of the gas chambers that still stands today. And you guys probably know enough about the Holocaust to have heard these stories. Jews were separated, were told, especially the women and children first, told they were going to be taking showers. They were showered with poison gas and murdered, and ultimately their bodies were pushed into crematoriums and burned. Because it's unfathomable the numbers that, when you have to deal with what do you do with this many people that you're killing. Ultimately, the German solution to that was to burn those bodies. In the end, over 6 million Jews, along with upwards of 6 million other undesirables. Whether they be Slavs, or gypsies, or homosexuals, or disabled, handicapped people mentally and physically, they treated the same. Just horrid treatment. News of these atrocities would get out. This is too big of an operation to not have news get out. And you guys read about a Regner Report, R-I-E-G-N-E-R. A Regner Report. This guy was in Switzerland. He was a secretary of the World Jewish Congress. And in 1942, he sent out a report saying, this is what's going on in Europe. Please, nations of the world, do something about this. And ultimately, aid did not or could not come. The United States responds to reports like this with condemnation of Nazi atrocities. But our official stance is there's really not much we can do about it. We do put together what's called a War Refugees Board, which is a presidential executive order creating an agency to help those that have their lives in danger in Europe, help them escape. And some Jews were allowed into the United States because of this, which has got a lot of Americans frustrated because that is pushing immigration beyond our quota system, our precious quota system. So ultimately, the numbers are not that great that are allowed in. Some have the suggestion that we should bomb the concentration camps. Concentration camps are located throughout Europe, okay? And with Auschwitz being one of the largest. So some suggest that we should be bombing the concentration camps or bombing the rail lines leading into the concentration camps. Because if we can stop the crematoria, or if we can stop the trains from entering, then we could slow down the German process of killing all these Jews. This wasn't ultimately done for a couple reasons. One, Auschwitz is big, all right? And this is taken from above, and you've got like dozens of barracks. So like this is like an actual city of death that the Germans had created. How can you guarantee with bombing campaigns that you're actually going to hit the crematoria and not all of the barracks and kill many of these people ourselves? Or by the same token, how do you hit a rail line? In World War II, how do you target a rail line? You fly above, and that's the problem. It's too far for us to get dive bombers in there. You fly above and you drop thousands of bombs. And you cross your fingers that some of those bombs will hit their target. And in most cases, most don't. And these are horribly dangerous missions, flying over enemy territory with enemy anti-aircraft fire. So it was calculated that we would save ultimately more Jewish lives by directing our air assaults against German industrial and military complexes than against the concentration camps.
And now we'll never know.
You never know ultimately what would have happened had we made a different decision, but I think back to Adolf Hitler's decision to bomb London rather than focusing on the airstrips in London, in England, right? And that ultimately led to his defeat in the Battle of Britain. Maybe we were right on that. But this debate does exist, and you guys have a little bit of a reading on that within the sections that you were to read. By April 1945, Allied armies, first the Americans, and then later the Soviets in the East, start coming across the camps. And we begin liberating these prison camps. One of the first and largest was a camp in Germany called Buchenwald, B-U-C-H-E-N-W-A-L-D, Buchenwald, where 20,000 prisoners, mostly Jews, were rescued, but over 30,000 bodies were found. And these images, and we're going to be able to look at some of them on Monday, absolutely turned the hearts and minds of those soldiers that found them. The American officers ordered not only their men to walk through the camps to see what they were fighting a war for, but they would also later have German citizens that lived in the surrounding communities march through the camps so they can see what they claim to not know was going on during the war. After the war, President Truman will issue an executive order that allows another 16,000 Jews to enter the United States as refugees, and more increases to the quota system will follow. There will be more sympathy for allowing more Jews into the United States after the Holocaust.